Hello and welcome to Two Blokes in a Cave, a vaguely philosophical podcast hosted by me, Carlton Sin, and Brendan, producer Brendos, in the cave, filling in for Cameron, who has not made it this week, possibly pooped on by a bat, maybe traumatized, we actually don't know. So, producer Brendos, welcome to Two Blokes in a Cave, the cave. Good to have you on.
Thank you. It's good having me.
How's it feel?
It's good having me.
In the cave, the different kind of experience now that you're in here, claustrophobic, behind a tiny desk, in front of a really, really magnificent piece of art. We've got a pretty great topic today. One that I think kind of blends historical knowledge with a philosophical question that is as important as it was when posed as it is today. Do you want to take us away with what we're talking about today?
Yeah, so we're looking at the philosophy of war, or the just war theory, which I believe is a Catholic-founded theory.
I know. No, actually, many of them are. You go back far enough. A lot of the moral and ethics that define particularly the Western world. One of the things that attracted me to Catholicism originally was it's so intertwined with Western history that it's hard to pass Western and Catholic, especially in the early days. So, but that's very good. Just war theory. I think it was St Augustine writing about it in, I think, maybe the 5th century, and then later obviously improved upon by Thomas Aquinas. And then I think there's been more contemporary people adding to it, though there is still, there's a little bit of back and forth as to what justifies a war. And perhaps when it's okay to go to war. It's certainly not a definitive text, I think. It's certainly, there's room for a little bit of debate in between there. But we'll get into that in a little bit. I think...
So St Augustine of Hippo. Do you know where the Hippo part comes in?
I think Hippo is where he lived. It's in North Africa, I'm pretty confident. But I'll have to double check. But I'm pretty sure that's just where he was from. North African guy... I haven't read up on him in his sort of chronology, his sort of origins or chronology recently, but I am familiar that I think his 2 greatest works were The Confessions and City of God, and I think it's in City of God that he talks about just war. So very, very cool guy though. One of the 2 sort of most philosophically relevant Catholic theologians, I think, him and Aquinas certainly. In terms of people that you would know, or people that your average sort of philosophy enjoyer would probably have heard of and have read about, would be him and Aquinas. Mostly Aquinas, but still a little bit of him. So,
yeah, from what I've read up on it, it seems like the just war theory is still being worked on today. So that is kind of a cool thing that it was developed so early on by these philosophers.
Yeah. And
it's still being etched out today, which I think we'll continue in that and have a bit of a discussion on what is a just war and are there any things that can make war justified.
Well, it's a good point. I think one of the most interesting points in the just war theory, I don't know Latin despite enjoying a good Latin mass, so I'm just going to give you the English version. But the reasons to go to war, I thought the first point being you have to have the right authority to actually go to war. So before we get into who has the authority to call men to arms, what is a war? It's I think there is a definition of war that we can pull from the dictionary, but there is also an abstract idea of a war that might be philosophically relevant. But what was your understanding of, if someone says war to you, what's the first thing that kind of comes to mind?
So I did a little bit of research on war, and I was going, okay, well, what is the difference between war and terrorism? And I thought there would
jumping right into it.
I thought there would be a big difference, and
yeah.
I don't think there's much of a difference at all. So the biggest difference being that war is openly declared from a state or nation, as opposed to a terrorist act being from a group with an ideology or
not affiliated with the power,
with a nation,
a right authority, you would say.
Yeah.
Okay.
So more like with the territorial land, so your nation or state. So you could have a group, it could be religious, could be something else, but like of a common ideology that's not part of your country.
Yeah, okay. So you have to be, I guess we could probably blend then the two. So for it to be a war, in your understanding, it would have to have, the just war theory will go, a proper authority to declare the war, and that's usually a head of state. I'm pretty sure the limit or the list is actually quite sparse. It's like king.
It does say a leader of recognized political community. So a prime minister,
president, king.
Yes.
Okay, can call on a war.
Of a nation. So a religious leader would not be considered.
Yeah, no, there is some debate about Pope Urban II not having the authority to call the holy wars in the First Crusade, but there is certainly a lot of debate, and that's not really the focus of what we're doing today. But it is interesting because I guess it sort of proves the point we'll get to a bit later on, that rightly or wrongly, or having the authority or not, doesn't actually determine whether or not war is declared or that you will go on to war. And moreover, it doesn't really care that you will follow any of the prescribed guidelines. I've always sort of thought of myself as a bit of a realist, certainly in terms of trying to sit at the big boy table and talk about the geopolitical situation around the world, or certainly looking back at the historical perspectives, like in World War II, you would say. There's a pretty famous example of, after, I think it was World War II, it might have been World War I, but it was one of the world wars where the Allies essentially had won, and they had brought the Germans to the negotiating table to speak out and flesh out a surrender. I think it might be World War I, actually, now that I'm remembering. And the terms were so egregious, or the imposition was so much that the German government at the time just said, well, we're just going to go back to fighting. Because I don't know if anyone that knows history, the armistice was called an armistice is a ceasefire. It's not necessarily a surrender. It's just we don't want to fight anymore. This is kind of pointless. And there's a lot of fun, interesting debates about the Germans were losing. The Eastern Front had collapsed. There's like 3 million troops coming to the West, but they were certainly losing some ground in the Western Front. But the point is, it wasn't a traditional surrender that would have recognized, or the German side would not have recognized, a full-on defeat, like we're ready to just accept what you give us. And then when they were negotiating, the terms being pushed on them were too egregious. They said, well, actually, we're going to go back to fighting. And then they were revised, and they came back with a still fairly heavy, still fairly heavy, but but less so, less egregious, more palatable for the German state, which obviously still was extremely disruptive, and history be what it is. The point I guess I'm trying to make is you need to have the right authority to call the war, and it doesn't matter, I guess, it doesn't matter once the war has started whether or not you play by any set of rules, because there is a point to which people go, well, actually, I would rather, choose death, or I would rather push the boundaries to win when the stakes are at their highest. So,
especially when your back's up against the wall.
Absolutely.
Is there really any rules that you wouldn't break?
Well, that's exactly right.
History's kind of proven that.
Well, there is, the cliche of history is written by the winners. It only looks bad in retrospect, but if you win, all of a sudden you're the winner, you're the hero.
And if you're about to lose, all
bets are
goes
off.
Out the window.
It doesn't matter.
Exactly.
I will make a very interesting point, because I am a lover of specifically Greek, like ancient Greek culture, and I'm reading a series by Will Durant. Bit of a plug for my boy Will Durant, even though he's dead. Cool guy, great series. The Greek ethos actually was quite a lot different to sort of what we would consider more Anglo-Western, sort of European, in that in the Iliad, which is one of the seminal classical works that everyone should read at least once in their life, the Trojan horse is a pretty dirty, deceptive, terrible, like it's a very much not cool military strategy, essentially lying and cheating to get into the city to then butcher a bunch of people at night. Like, it's not honorable.
Glorious gift.
Right, but it's not an honorable way to fight. But the Greek perspective is like, yo, bro, we're not here to kiss babies. We're here to win a war. And by any means necessary, we will win the war. And they viewed that kind of, I would say, deception and what's the antonym for honorable? I don't know. Kind of cowardly, devious. Like, it's certainly not something that I would uphold as an honorable kind of virtuous thing to do. The Greeks at the time thought it was the best thing since sliced bread. They thought, this is so good. We just won this war. We've tricked our way into the city and we've butchered everybody, and it's great because we won. Which is very interesting, because I think modern Western philosophy is certainly undergirded by a sense of honor and chivalry and like fighting fairly. Like, you don't hit people when they're down. You know, I know you're a big UFC guy. I'm a little bit less into the UFC, more into boxing, but you don't hit someone when they take a knee or they hit the canvas. You don't just jump on them and start wailing them. There's like
that
a bit
is
more.
what you're doing.
I know. Yes, I know.
But yeah, they play within the rules, and as soon as the ref's calling the fight,
I just think
there's no more extra punches after the bell.
That part I just think is so incredibly brutal, because I remember watching a fight with you. I think it was McGregor versus Aldo or something like that years ago, and the dude's knocked out, like falling to the canvas, and then gets like 3 hammer punches to the head. I'm like, this is so brutal. And that's, you know, again, you sign up for it. That's the rules. I'm not saying anyone's not honorable in that situation. I'm just saying I like that the seminal Western martial art was boxing for a long time. And there is this sort of gentlemanly element to boxing where it's, you know, it's very controlled. It's sort of about movement, and there's a science to it. And then once the person even just takes a knee, you just back off. You don't hit people when they're down. I think there is, the point I'm trying to make is that idea of fighting really honorably undergirds a lot of the modern Western ethos, where it didn't with the Greeks, which I thought was interesting. Certainly interesting enough to bring up, because certainly by all accounts, if we look at the general parameters for a just war, you know, butchering, raping, and pillaging is definitely on the no list. Like, that's not what we do. I think there is even the idea of a concerted effort to avoid civilian casualties to the greatest degree possible. Obviously, in any war, any conflict, even like an economic fight between nations, there's going to be casualties, people, individuals that will be kind of copping some strays. But this idea that we should try, or it should be one of our top priorities to avoid civilian losses and casualties, is reflected in pretty a wide swath of European history, where you would see armies meet on the field outside of the cities, outside of the villages, and fight. And then when they retreated, you know, like, there would be a very respectable, okay, we're going to give back your officer, and we're going to, you know, treat everybody very dignified. And there's just it seemed almost cartoonishly civilized now. Like, if you watch any of the movies or you read any books about if a captain was, you know, captured in battle, they would just return him. Like, all right, mate, you got to go back and look after the boys and come back and fight us tomorrow. And you're like, why would you do that?
Yep.
They're really valuable. You should, you know, hold them. And they go, no, we need to get the captains back, because they ordered the troops and keep everybody in line. And it's sort of, there's a very honorable sensibility about this this sort of warfare that changed, I think, in World War One, mostly because of the scale and the scope and the magnitude of damage that can be done and was done.
Start to unlock what people are capable of when all hell breaks out, essentially, on a global scale.
Right.
So I'll just, before we go too far, I'll just take you back to, so there are 3 criteria for the just war theory. I'm going to attempt to drop some Latin here.
Yeah, no worries.
I find it really interesting. I'm going to...
Latin is honestly, I've got a mate who speaks pretty decent Latin. He was in the monastery for a couple of years, and like, he can read a fair bit. Like, he said he read The Grinch in Latin. That's kind of cool.
That is pretty cool.
Very cool. Anyway, he speaks much better than I do, but it's a weird language, because it's really it kind of forms so many of the European languages because obviously it's the kind of
For
the
some
origin.
reason I do find it quite interesting.
And I just
there's
feel
a couple of quotes.
I do feel like
get
it
to
might
that.
be, and maybe it's just me romanticizing the past and being Catholic, but I'm like, oh, it's such a cool language. It's so precise and elegant and kind of beautiful.
I agree with
Even
you.
just
and
to,
I'm not
yeah,
Catholic,
that's
so-
cool. That's right. Not yet. We're gonna get everybody, so don't worry about it. But you know, the idea is it sounds beautiful to the ear. Do you know what I mean? Anyway, go and take it away.
It
Take it away.
won't right now, but I do agree with you on principle. So the first one is "Jus ad bellum." So what I've discovered is bellum means war.
Yeah.
So "Jus
like a
ad bellum" is justice towards war. I'll just take you through the other two, and then we'll break down the first one. But then there's "Jus." So "Jus in bello," which is justice in war, which is what you're talking about. So when you're in the thick of it, are there some general rules that we can all agree to? And I think we can, but we also, people are going to break them, and they have throughout since the beginning of time.
Yeah,
and the
people be
last one
dirtbags.
is "Jus post bellum," which is justice after war. Which I
Yeah,
found this
very
one interesting because it does say part of a just war would be restoring the country to how it was before the war. And I just was wondering to myself how often that's ever happened.
I mean, America
It's a lot of money
rebuilt.
donated.
America rebuilt Japan after they bombed it.
That is
Very
a
true,
good
yeah.
thing.
They did. Well, I mean, part of it was Japan became very much. They opened the Japanese market to the US, which was. You might not know this. You might know this. If you asked your dad, back when he was a kid, made in Japan was as common as made in China, and it was sort of cheap stuff was made in Japan, and then as they kind of rebounded and rebuilt much the same way that China has now, they were like, oh, now we're building our own things at a higher quality and better, and we shifted away from that as the sort of prosperity of the economic development rose. A lot of the sort of cheaper labor was exported out to more developing countries like China and Vietnam and India.
Yeah.
That was very interesting. My dad told me all the time, he's like, yeah, back in my day, like made in Japan was not good. But now you'd be like, oh, made in Japan's probably pretty good.
There you go.
And that's a whole economic thing that I did in business school. So
I thought about this myself because going back to the very first one, like justice towards war, is there ever a just cause to start a war?
sure.
There's a very obvious one that I'm going to give you as a freebie.
Yeah.
That, I mean, not everyone's going to agree with this, but I agree with this wholeheartedly. Self-defense. So if you, as a nation...
I push back on this idea that I think everybody agrees with this. I've met a pacifist once a self-proclaimed pacifist, right? We're at the bar at QUT. It's just a great university in Queensland. And we're just chatting away, and he's like, yeah, I'm a pacifist, man, like full-on pacifist. And I was like, no violence ever. He's like, no, man, that's what pacifist is, no violence. I'm like, oh, well, give me your wallet. He's like, no. I was like, were you going to stop me if I try to take it? He's like, yeah. Not a pacifist, are you? Got him every time. There is an abstract idea to war, though. I think what I wanted to get at earlier, before I got off on a waffle, we think of war as like a hot war with guns and death and fighting between armies. But there is like an abstract war in the sense that there's an ideological conflicts that happen, the Cold War being a very good one. There's obviously a lot of, you would think maybe religious tensions in certain parts of the world. Think like India and Pakistan, maybe the Middle East, maybe even Protestant Europe and Catholic Europe, being a little bit like the friction is there and there's tension. You probably wouldn't call it a war, but ideological warfare exists and it is real, even though it's less tangible, it's less easy to define or to touch because the communism, kind of communist capitalism.
I kind of think of it like potential energy versus kinetic energy. Like there's a build up there and there's the possibility that something can go down at any moment. But if it didn't eventuate, does that mean it wasn't a conflict, wasn't a war?
Yeah, well, I mean, does a war need to have casualties? Or that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think, does a war need to have physical armies fight it to be considered a war? Like going back to our our traditional understanding of war would probably be like, you can't have a war without nations mobilizing the troops.
Two armies standing opposite each other in a battlefield. I think that's what everyone kind of thinks.
That's 100%.
We're getting away from that further and further.
Well, absolutely getting away from that. But how could you define warfare that doesn't involve troops fighting one another, but does directly describe states combating one another in a serious way? Is it still warfare? This is not even like a gotcha thing. I'm just curious. Like, how broad is our definition of war? And do we need to, especially nowadays, we need to broaden it further to encompass, like just even a thing as simple as economic sanctions, which are a deterrent used very, very willingly by countries. There is casualties. There are people that suffer because of a government's decision to enforce a sanction on another country. Like, there are real tangible effects on individuals, most of whom get lost in the sort of grand picture when we play these games with big states and stuff. So I'm posing the question to you, like, for the purpose of this, we might speak more directly for the traditional armies fighting, but is there a case to be made that warfare is actually a much broader topic in and of itself, and maybe it encompasses more than just what springs to mind so vividly because it's such a visceral reaction to hearing war?
Yep. So I'll just say, I think we're heading in a direction where we'll have, so a big weapon that we'll use is on information. So we have private companies like Elon Musk that are building satellites like in space, circumferencing the world. And like, that's not tied to like a nation or anything like that, but that's a powerful thing. And a lot of wars, or potential wars, what we were talking about, can be won by simply like cutting the communication and the information from a country. So before there was any ballistics being like projected, if you just cut off that person's communication and the way they obtain knowledge, so like what they see through like satellite, what they hear in radio frequency, all that kind of thing, they will be rendered helpless before they've even...
They don't know what to do. There's actually a pretty compelling argument.
Is that like a kind of thing that you were getting towards, or have I just gone off on a complete tangent?
Yes, yeah. Like there is more to. I guess like the answer is yes.
More to the traditional concept of war.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it is broad enough to encompass sort of all aspects of stately life. You can do a lot of things. I think that would fall under a loose definition of warfare. And I think we come back to this question in a little bit when we ask, is warfare justified? I agree completely. Like, there is obviously times where war is justified.
Yeah, so
justifiable.
I think we both fully agree. Carlton's put it out there that if there's anyone out there that disagrees that self-defense is a just reason for war, we'd love to hear it. I think we're both of the opinion that...
Just give me your name, your address. I'll be right over there to take your house. Obviously, you won't put up any fight, which is great. I appreciate that. It's very charitable.
And on this topic, I might just drop one of my favourites.
Yeah, no, please.
It is my favourite Latin phrase.
Here we go.
And I'm going to butcher it, but si vis pacem parabellum, which is, if you want peace, prepare for war.
Yeah, it's a pretty great... Yeah.
To defend yourself in war, you must be prepared, and I'm just a massive advocate for this. If you don't spend any money in your military defense, be prepared to have a really bad day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really bad time.
It's the best part about quotes like that is that they come back through history so often. And they're quite profound. I think Teddy Roosevelt very famously said, walk soundly but carry a big stick, or walk quietly but carry a big stick, which is obviously a modern kind of play on that. There was a inscription on the Venetian arsenal that read something to the effect of, a people are happy when in times of peace they think of war. And then even if you read into a lot of the just war theory, the idea is we go to war not for the plunder or the sort of honor of battle, but to restore the peace. And that is a kind of a recurring theme, and maybe one of the principally justifiable reasons to go to war. It's like, well, there can be these tensions, these build-up of energy, as you say, and people may suffer, whether it is unfair trade, not enforcing... Like a lockdown. People wanting to make some sort of pilgrimage to a holy land, being mistreated, countries allowing like piracy to operate on their shores that very, disrupt. I'm talking about the Barbary pirates of like the 17th, 18th century. Fascinating stuff. They were North African, the Barbary coast. They would go up to Ireland and England, hit small villages, take a bunch of people and sell them into slavery. I guess what I'm trying to say is like a reason for war would be you need to get that under control. Like you have a country, these people operate in your country, they are doing pretty deplorable things and you just stop them, or we're going to send in the sort of navy or the army to stop them if you don't. I think that would be the most justifiable wars would be, and those ones are probably very morally pretty easy to be like, yeah, that's easy to pick a side on who's good and who's bad. The ones that might be more difficult would be, I think, the most common form or reason humans have engaged in large-scale conflicts like wars in the past would be over resources.
Is that just?
Yeah, that's the question. Like, is that just? Because
I don't think it is.
Yeah,
but again, if you're the country with no resources, you're going to do what you can. Are you going to lie down and just starve? Or are you going to try and fight for survival?
Well, that's an interesting one about, I don't know how familiar you are with like A.J.P. Taylor or some of the writings about Imperial Japan before World War II. Yeah, okay. Anyway, very, very, very fascinating. A.J.P. Taylor was a English professor of history. He did his PhD in Vienna. I think it might have even been after the war, in like the late 1940s. He went into continental Europe and did some studies. But he posited that the Germans, and like again, not to get into a full World War II history lesson, but the Germans and their stated goals weren't specifically to conquer the whole world or to go crazy. And the reasons that Professor Taylor outlines is they just didn't have the resources necessary to conduct a war of that scale. There was no real interest, he posits, that they wanted to go to war with France, with England, with Russia, even though that all ended up happening. And if you follow the timeline of events, the Allies actually declared war on Germany before they had invaded, I think before they had made any major moves. I think they had, it might have been before they invaded Czechoslovakia. I have to double check, but it wasn't a major, like the timeline of events is a little bit fuzzy. I didn't research it before, but there wasn't a major conflict declared or fought, unless you count Poland, but
I thought I was about to say
Poland got hammered,
was the
but Russia also attacked Poland at the same time, and they didn't declare war on Russia. That was a very bizarre. That one was quite bizarre, I think. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, I forgot the point I'm trying to make actually. The point I'm trying to make is, the resources that Germany had weren't sufficient. They didn't have the stockpiles of oil. They didn't have enough resources to have a massive war, which is probably one of the reasons why they stalled out when they did and ended up losing. And likewise, the Japanese, after Pearl Harbor, the idea was, we don't have enough oil to do this. And the Americans essentially, like they said, we're going to stop trading you oil unless you retreat out of Manchuria, stop invading China and the sort of South Pacific. And they said there is a lot of oil in the South Pacific. If we just continue to conquer territories and we could just get our own oil, which was because Japan is actually quite a barren in terms of the resources you would need for modernity. It's quite barren. It doesn't have a lot of oil and coal resources itself. So they made the decision like, well, we don't have the resources. We're already like knee deep in Manchuria. We may as well just keep going. And that also didn't work out for them. But
if you made it halfway, would you go back? Or
yeah, that's what I mean. Like there's a weird moment where you're like,
no,
we've crossed the Rubicon, so to speak. So I'm not sure. But it was, a very, very powerful ploy that the Americans were able to utilize. Before they were involved in the war with sort of a military presence, they were able to pull some pretty significant levers because it made the Japanese, it put them on a clock and it made them have to change course. And the Germans did this too in Russia. They should have gone to the Caucasus, which is where all the oil reserves are, but instead they went to Stalingrad, which was a terrible military decision that may or may not have been made by a kind of megalomaniac like Hitler, overruling generals. But the idea was to go to the Caucasus, get the oil, and kind of stay there over the winter and then continue the campaign. But I digress because it's not that interesting, I guess. And the same thing with the Japanese. Like there was the idea like, well, we need to get all the oil that's in, but we also now have to worry about the Americans that are coming to fight us. So they attack Pearl Harbor with the intention of knocking out the Pacific Fleet and giving themselves that time and that buffer. Unfortunately, like the American industrial complex was so strong, they were pumping out like a battleship a week, and they just had the manufacturing might and the manpower to just overwhelm the Japanese. Once the conflict started, it was just too much. Yeah. And the supply lines were awful, and the Allies had this really strategically, like they had India, they had America, they had Australia, that were just close enough to one another where it's like it's very hard for the Japanese to occupy. Anyway, I digress. We're not talking about just the campaigns, but the point is resources are a big factor that people go to war.
100%.
Very, very hard for me to think off the cup. Is that ever justifiable?
I do have a couple of examples, and I don't know if any country has literally gone for war for this, but if we put what has happened aside and just think about what are the reasons that would make a justified war? There was a philosopher called Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Who said for the insurrection against oppressive rule, so being fascism or dictatorship. Would you see that as a just cause for war?
It's very difficult because who has the authority to rebel against the state, and how does one minimize casualties in a revolution, minimize the civilian loss? I think the French Revolution may be the most famous, and I think is the most disastrous for humanity, actually. But I digress in the abstract, but just the practical element of the French Revolution was awful. Like people were being killed, and I'm not talking about the terror. I'm talking about in riots. You got cannons being fired into people. You've got soldiers going through villages, and it's pretty rough.
Yeah,
the revolution. And then you've obviously got the brother on brother and fighting against the state. But what is the state? If there is a state of revolution in your country, who are you rebelling against? And are the old guard justified in using lethal force? History would say they certainly believe so. I mean, most peasant uprisings are pretty brutally squashed, and that generally means the death of tens of thousands of people. So revolution's a tough one. I don't think there's a very clear-cut answer, particularly if you read some of the older Catholic just war kind of doctrine. It would be I don't have the authority to call for a revolution.
Yeah, but we're on a podcast where we can just think
Yeah, no,
about
I'm
hypotheticals, so
hypothetically saying.
let me pose
okay.
you a question.
Pose the question away.
If you right here, right now,
Yep.
there was an enemy who was coming into Australia and going, Australia will become a dictatorship. You will no longer be a democracy. Do not oppose us. This is just what's going to happen. Would that
Stop resisting?
Yeah. Would you resist that? Like, I believe that I would.
Yeah.
I don't believe...
Okay, but you're saying that someone from outside Australia is coming into Australia. What if...
Yeah, well,
okay,
it's hard to do an example.
What if the Prime Minister of Australia, obviously no names or anything, but like if someone was elected Prime Minister of Australia, let's just make
like that example though, because it's not much of a war. So let's say Australia was divided in two, the West and the East.
We would kick their ass. Because everybody lives on the East. East Coast for life,
let's
baby.
Let's say, like, rather than the current Prime Minister...
But yeah, I'm not talking about any...
There was a conflict, and it divided the nation into two. However you want to dig that up.
Sure.
So there's two equal sides. One for dictatorship because they really love this guy. I don't know.
It probably is not a bad East versus West thing.
Steve Irwin.
Everyone loves Steve Irwin. What are you talking about?
So let's make him a dictator. Are you for this or are you opposed this? And like...
This is an interesting
going
point.
into it, like, for Australia to go into a dictatorship, like, we don't have a great system, but at least we have a chance to have our say. And when you have a dictatorship, there is no say.
There is no say.
I believe that is a just reason for war. What would you think?
Well, I'm more of an autocrat politically, so I don't... an autocrat being... I'd be pretty okay with a Catholic monarchy to be established. I don't care much for parliamentarian democracy. Not even really on a philosophical level. I just think practically it doesn't really work very efficiently. And I am philosophically drawn to the idea of a monarchy. However, would I resist if I saw let's make it more specific for me, because if it's just some banal government tyranny, probably not. I mean, like, what would change for me? Do you know what I mean? Like, if it's Steve Irwin becoming a dictator and he wants to just rescue the crocodiles, like, I don't really care, mate. Like,
fair
go
enough.
nuts. If it was someone trying to impose 1984 style restrictions on life and breaking up the family unit, then I think, of course.
So your answer is definitely depends on the dictator.
Well, first of all, I have an issue with the notion that all dictators are bad. The word dictator is Latin, and some of the greatest people to ever exist in human history were dictators for a brief time. Cincinnatus, for example, one of three people I can recall off the top of my head that willingly gave back absolute power. One or two, actually, I can't remember the other guy's name, in Rome, and then the other one being George Washington. But I digress on that point, because the larger, more interesting part to me is my willingness to rebel, of course, depends on how the thing that I'm rebelling against affects me. And if we have, and I don't want to get off on topics, I want to answer your question, and I want to answer it in a way that's satisfying to you and the audience. But if we have a dictator that comes in and makes the country better, well, I'm not going to rebel against someone that I think is doing a good job, obviously. So if we have a dictator, I suppose an interesting side question quickly for you is, are you so attached to our representative democracy in Australia that you would go to war with a dictator on principle, even if you may agree with some of the stances he made? Like, are you principally motivated to rebel against a dictator on that ground alone?
So For me, it's not about the person. It
Okay.
is all about the principle. I don't
Okay.
like any politician. I don't really have a strong side
Nice.
one way or the other, but I agree on the principle that the people should always have a say. And our voting system gives us, it's not much of a say, but it gives us some kind of a say
Yep.
compared to a dictatorship where this guy, like, you could strike gold and the guy's just like,
Yep.
I've got the answer for everyone
Sure,
to
yeah,
live
yeah.
the best life possible. Even if that's the case, the people do not have a say. So we, as the people, you're living your life and you'll never have a say. You'll never change the system. There's no possibility. I would rather have a 0.1% chance of changing the outcome than a 0. That's basically where I stand. And
Okay.
I would call that a justified cause for war.
Man, I think 0.1% is probably hard to justify. It's very interesting to me because I suppose, yeah, I am much less inclined to. It would take a lot for me to want to go to war, and I might. I've got fairly conservative sort of religious values, right? And I don't think the government reflects my values all that well at all. But I have very, very low interest in rebelling against the government. It would have to get pretty bad for me to be like, all right, it's worth, rebelling.
Yep.
Just because I'm not represented. I don't feel like, and maybe this is a bit of a Debbie Downer attitude. I'm like, I don't really feel like we have any say. I know you mentioned like 0.1 as a bit of an exaggerated effect, but we do vote, which is true. I just wonder, like, is voting something that we have idealized above its proper station? Like, is voting all it's cracked up to be? Like, do you really need a say in stately affairs? Like, do you care about what's going on internationally?
So,
do you care? Like,
again, it's on principle.
it's the
I don't want to
idea
go
that you...
into semantics about
No, of course.
different things, but on principle,
You want
if
to
the
be
people
involved.
can vote against you as a leader, if they have that ability, and I'm not talking about like a corrupt
System.
democracy, I'm talking about a legitimate democracy where the people can vote against you at any time. It keeps you in check. It keeps you thinking about the people. Where if you look at like the Roman Caesars, like they would listen to the people, but if they just didn't agree with what the people said, they're just like, I'm the Caesar. I'll do what I want, and that is the dictatorship. Like they could be great until, they could listen to us, but at the end of the day, a voting system forces them to be in check.
Sure. I hear you. I have definitely got no issues with anyone standing on principle at all. I am a little bit surprised, just because I've known you for a while, that you would be willing to go, because I
Remember,
think,
this is a hypothetical.
Yeah.
Nations are divided. Like I'm seeing this as like,
we're talking like
there's gonna
Civil
be
War in
some
America
kind
is what
of,
you're
like,
trying to
yeah.
set up. Yeah, cool.
like
I think
you
it is.
have to be
It's
pretty
hugely
dire
interesting.
situations.
Yeah,
but
to
it's
get
like,
to that spot,
if you had to choose a side,
you would choose the democracy side.
yeah, and again,
I love it. I feel like I can see you in like an Obi-Wan
I don't
Kenobi robe. I choose democracy.
I don't want to like run onto the battlefield
Republic.
with my like grenades and my gun things. Like,
Yeah, you've got
I
kids.
would hope it wouldn't amount to that kind of thing, but that is the side I would choose. It's just an example when I'm thinking about this as a justified cause for
that's
war.
very good. I know,
I was
and
trying
there
to
is.
put you in a situation where it's like it would be personal to you and you had to make a choice.
It's a great. No, it's a great point. I think there is in the back of my mind. Of course, I would think of, is this the start of something quite terrible? But I also, a part of being, I'm more conservative by nature, which means I'm slower to react to change. it doesn't mean I hate change or I'm anti-change. It just means I don't jump on the latest fad, as I'm sure you will have noticed. Just in, being friends with me, I'm not a quick to, jump on TikTok or whatever. I'm not on TikTok. I'm just not into that kind of stuff. It takes me a while to get onto like Instagram, something. So the
football related.
I do love some football. I guess what I'm trying to say is I would slow roll it a bit and be like, well, what is actually going on? Is this something that I'm willing to die for? And I think a man who has nothing, a man who doesn't know what he would die for has not anything to live for. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's very important for men and women to have lines in the sand, principled approaches to life. They would say, you know what? I would die for this. For me and you, I speak for you very seldomly, but I suppose we would die for our children without thinking twice. Probably the same for our wives. And there are things that, without question, yeah,
Definitely for our wives.
yeah. Sorry, I probably sounded terrible. Of course. But what I'm trying to say is that we have things that we would definitely die for. I'm not sure a political change would be something that I would immediately jump to. If I thought it would go on to make my children's lives unbearable or disastrously worse than mine, then that's something that would warrant serious consideration. Another one of the tenets of just war theory, which I thought was very interesting, I'm not sure if you caught this in the sort of the initial reading we did, but there is an idea that you don't just declare war. Dang it. You don't just declare war without the chance of winning. You have to have I don't remember the exact way Aquinas put it, but it was, you have to have a reasonable chance of winning. So if today you and I were like, you know what, just sick of this Australian government, let's go and start a revolution. This is only hypothetical and not real opinions, by the way. That would not be a just war, even if we thought there was a reason to go to war. It wouldn't be just, because we have absolutely no chance of, winning such a battle. So that is a strong consideration also for me, because
what I've got here is for a war to be, so this is, does it have due proportionality, which is what you're speaking of?
Yep.
For a war to be just, the quality of the peace resulting from the war needs to be superior to what has happened if no war has fought. So the war has to be beneficial.
Well, it has to be beneficial. It has to be winnable. Like, if we just start firebombing random streets with a handful of basically we'd be terrorists. You know what I mean? Like, there is no, like, what distinction would we have between us and terrorists if we're just rebelling against a government we don't agree with? There's no justice in that action.
So it continues on to say this is also required. It is also requires that we have some probability of success in going to war. So that's where you're coming from. So I don't know if I'm right in interpreting this, but when I was reading this, I kind of equated it to the English versus the Zulu. If you know much about that.
I do know.
So that
a lot about that.
That is a war. It's like defined as a war, and yet it was so one-sided.
The final battle was very one-sided. There were some Zulu victories.
Okay.
But they were
so you would say the Zulu had a probability of success?
They got whacked pretty significantly, but they were defending themselves,
like,
so,
As a just cause to go into war, would you say, like...
Well, I'm, like I said, I can't off the cuff right now recall the exact reason for the British going to war with the Zulu. I do know that there was a couple of probably land or just colonialization in general.
A quote from a comedian, Stephen K. Amos, that the English arrived in Africa and just said, "You like these beads? You can have these beads. I will give you these beads." and I will just take from here until the horizon. Okay, thanks. I'm gonna steal his joke, but it is about 15 years old, so I feel like it's fair game.
It's fair game. That's fair enough. I mean, I don't know how the way I think colonialization was a good thing, even if there were elements of it that were pretty bad. I think overall, I think the world's better off.
Well, I think it's like resources and technology. So the English had more technology. They saw the value in the resources of that land. And
sure.
I wouldn't say it's just when we're talking about the just war theory. But it's definitely a common reason.
Well, it is certainly interesting because it would be hard to argue modern conceptions of borders. Most of them were made by the English.
Yes.
Notwithstanding. But, that's also
a good point.
Pretty outrageous.
They were
like, it's kind of
by
weird.
war, right?
Yeah. They're kind of, they kind of don't mean anything. They're very, damn it. Good, I thought we fixed this thing. Can you flip the top light on there? Just see if that makes a difference.
This one?
Yeah. Perfect. Let's just see if that helps. Maybe Cameron's much more...
Cameron's the light expert. We're going to blame it on Cameron. All these technical difficulties.
I would say
blonde one.
It's always been the blonde one. What do we make about land disputes and borders if they are extremely abstract? Like the idea of a border.
Well, some are, some aren't. The continent of Africa isn't abstract. It's
but no one's
island
made
of Australia.
Yeah, that's very true. But no one's making the argument that I've heard that the continent of Africa is a country.
No, it's not.
And the continent of Australia, it is a country now. But if you ask the indigenous people that were here before us, they would say, well, we're actually like 26,000 unique tribes with our own leadership structures, as I've been reliably informed. So it's not as if they're one continuous body, as we would think of it today. Like we think of Australia as this, like, oh, it's one place. Obviously, it's an island. It's a big island, but it's an island, so that's an easy one to do. But it could just as easily be, it's the size of Europe. It could just as easily have like 8 countries in it. You know what I mean? Like a minimum, just have 8 different countries. If it weren't so far away from everyone else, it might actually have been 8 countries. I'm kind of going in this direction because I think it's interesting. And maybe we'll put this in like as a thing. I saw a very interesting map of the continental USA, and they had the demographic breakdown of like who lives where or the most common ancestry. And like the middle part of America was mostly German. And people don't know this, but German was almost the national language of America at one point because there were so many German immigrants there. And then you've got, I think California down to Texas was sort of Hispanic, and you had like pockets of Italian in the Northeast, very, very Italian. And there were different ethnicities, and like there was British and stuff. But it was a very interesting thing that you could look at that and go, oh, there's very, there's Irish and whatnot. You could go, if things went a little bit differently, you could easily have several different countries. I mean, even when the US started and it rebelled, the 13 states that rebelled against the British, like that was a country. Like the next several states could have easily, I mean, France, for goodness sake, France had the Louisiana Purchase. They bought the land off France. France owned that. It was part of the French Empire. So it's not as if we can look at it and go, oh yeah, America has existed. It could very easily have been another European style continent with just many, many different nations. I mean, even in Canada, they have Quebec, which is a French-speaking state of Canada, and they have...
I don't know if you already mentioned, but like the Spanish in South America could have just as easily come up to the north, and
absolutely,
North America could have been Spanish.
Very true, very, very true. So yeah, I think that is very interesting to me, and the idea of this line delineates between us. Sometimes there are cool natural boundaries, like now I'm blanking on the bloody mountain names and the ranges, but the mountain range at the top of Italy. Well, it's pretty easy to go, well, our borders go all the way to there.
Yep.
I can't remember the name of the mountain range, so shame on me.
As far as the eye can see.
Basically, like, it almost if you like a topographical map of Europe, there is a mountain range. I think it's the Pyrenees. I could be wrong. I don't like being wrong, but I think it's the Pyrenees that separates France from Spain. It's just a nice little mountain range right across there with a very narrow part to go through on a couple of sections, mostly on the Mediterranean side. And then, the Italian has these mountains. I can't remember what that's called at all for the life of me, unfortunately. But there's some, that's easy geographically to go, like our side of the mountain, your side of the mountain, super easy. Or the Rhine River, or, rivers often like your side of the river, my side of the river. Very easy. But when you've just got a sprawling plateau, you're like, I'm not really sure like where yours ends and mine begins.
Yeah.
Like it's a lot harder
with
to
the river when you start to fish the river. Like
what do you do? Who owns? Yeah, exactly. It gets complicated, but at least it's easy enough to go like, we could separate it and go, the river is the dividing line, natural geography. This is your side, my side, and we can argue about how we use the river later, but like at least we know whose side we're on. If it's just a sprawling space, as a lot of Africa doesn't have a lot of huge mountain ranges that very easily delineate, like, oh, it's Tanzania and that's, Botswana. Like, it's harder to do if the borders are kind of arbitrary because someone came in and just drew them randomly. I mean, even in America, like if you look at the American continent, it kind of goes as a straight line and then it kind of goes down like this and it kind of goes up. And that's because people, I think there was, I can't remember exactly who it was, so I feel kind of silly now, but there was this idea that the mighty Mississippi would go all the way up basically indefinitely. So they just said, follow the parallel along to the Mississippi. And they're like, we don't know because it ended in the continental USA. Well, you don't know where it is at the top. And there was it was difficult. And also we're talking about people that did this, with like a sundial and a compass, and they're trying to walk through the harsh wilderness being like, this is ours, this is ours. Like, it's very, very difficult work, and it's very easy to see how that's not a super precise way to just say, this is definitively our land.
Yep.
And obviously when we go back a couple hundred years, people walking around like, we don't have GPS, we don't have satellite, we're just kind of here, and I can't see you here, so I'm going to take this. This sounds like this is about where my borders end. And then you go, it's, difficult.
Yep.
Is that just? No. That's like the messiest possible example I could think of.
I totally get where you're coming from. And all these things that we're talking about, throughout the beginning of time, we've broken these rules. It doesn't mean
Very
that
true.
we shouldn't have them, but, it's not... is always very complex. It's not straightforward, and they're going to be broken moving forward.
100%. I think if I circle back to the example I gave in the Iliad and how the Greeks responded to that deceptive play of putting people in the Trojan horse, I think deep down all of us have a little bit of that Trojan horse. Like, I saw a great quote today that was, you don't realize how bad a person you are until you try actively to be a good person. Because most of us are pretty passive in life. Like, if you try to be a good person, you'll realize how the gap between you and where you want to be is.
Yep.
And I think when pushed, a lot of us probably are pretty happy to take the Trojan horse victory if we can get a victory. Do you know what I mean? We value winning. We're a very production-based society. We want to get the W, so to speak, however we can get it. And I think whilst it's tremendous to have a framework of justice and just war theory to operate under, it's pretty unreasonable to expect humans to abide by those rules.
So another example of that, and I don't know how accurate the history is, I'm sorry, but one of my favorite movies is The Patriot.
Great movie, Mel Gibson.
So,
Unreal.
the Americans were losing because they were playing by the rules. They were lining up, they were being noble. Like, what was considered noble warfare? They were doing it,
Guerrilla
and
warfare, baby.
they were losing because the English had
better.
more resources.
They were just
So,
very good.
The Americans, at least in the movie, discovered that, hey, we don't actually have to play by these rules. We can just hide in the forest. We can get a flank. We can... And they became like military strategy. And I mean, it was military strategy a long time before that. It was Sun Tzu. But that was how war at that time was played out until a team started losing.
They're like, this sucks.
You know what? We're going to change the game. So I think like that's a really good example of...
The American Revolutionary War is fascinating because the Americans were getting the shit kicked out of them for a long portion, and there was many factors that went into the victory ultimately by the Americans. One of the major players is actually the French, who were fighting the English in like 7 different theaters of combat all over the world, and really distracting and annoying and haggling. And the French, I think in the movie they come in extremely late. And, you know, they're mostly like, we're here, you know, we. But I think they probably played a more pivotal role because it also, like in 1812...
The Irish came as well.
Yeah, there's many people. I mean, the English, whilst I'm a fan, you know, I think they were very impressive. You know, like the Roman Empire, you'd be like, very impressive. Everyone like looks back, kind of romanticizes it. But if you weren't Roman back in the day, you probably didn't like the Roman Empire. They're kicking the crap out of you all the time. Kind of the same with the English. Like if you weren't English, you like kind of want to get on those English dudes.
It's kind of the same as America today.
Very much so. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. And when you're on top, you know, you get a sore neck. So there is this, a lot of things went right. A lot of battles that could have very easily ended the American continental forces, but there was some luck, you know, some potentially divine providence. Who knows, like how they ended up winning, how they ended up kind of gutting it out. But it was, it's a cool victory. And I don't know how much guerrilla warfare played a part in it, but it's a cool movie. Historically, I'm not sure like it's hard to even to say how much of it was if there was a change of military strategy or if there was, you know, different supply lines and different conflicts all over the place. It's hard to tell what turned the tide, but I know what you mean. Like, hey, have you considered not lining up and walking into bullets? Because we could probably win some battles if we didn't.
It's a lot more effective if we use trees as cover.
Just walk into lead bullets and get my arm amputated. Sounds
I don't know
horrible.
how you feel, but I did have a first thought, so I think we might do a 2-parter.
Yeah, that sounds very good. Yeah, no, I'm ready to go. This was
I think we could. Yeah. We've covered.
Any final thoughts on the Just War stuff, or are you happy?
I think we can. I mean, the first thought does go into a little bit of the justice in war. So we did touch on it, but we can speak a little bit more in depth about different war crimes. And I think we can all ultimately agree that they are, but, you know, maybe we can think of some more or we'll find out next time.
Should have brainstormed some war crimes. 2 blokes in a cave, trying to get out of the cave and not commit serious war crimes. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for me being in this much well-lit cave. The producer cave is a lot dimmer and darker, so it was a good time. Thank you.
Stitch up. All right. See you later, guys.